Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Blake Society event. I'm Stephen Pritchard, and it's lovely to see so many of you here this evening. We have a very special guest for you, which is probably why you've signed up in your multitudes. Reading Patrick Harpur's books got me thinking about Blake in a very different way. It was my son, William Blake Pritchard, who's online tonight, I'm glad to see, from Ireland, bought me my first Patrick Harpur book, which was The Philosopher's Secret Fire, A History of the Imagination. And it got me thinking about Blake in terms of a whole range of things. Shamanic initiation, vision quests, and alchemy. Patrick references Blake and Jung, and a whole number of other things, but it helped to, say, contextualize Blake in a sense for me, and to give me all sorts of approaches to Blake that I hadn't had before from different directions, and from the different side of things. My copy of Daimonic Reality, A Field Guide to the Other World, has disappeared into the other world. I've been searching the house for it for some days. But that one made me think very much about, that book made me think very much about the nature of vision. And The Philosopher's Secret Fire, which I held up, subtitled A History of the Imagination, of course, is so appropriate for Blake and all other artists, philosophers, thinkers who deal so strongly in the imagination. We also have one of my favorite novels of all time, Mercurius, The Marriage of Heaven and Earth, disappearing mysteriously in and out of the other world there, look. And this novel, as its subtitle suggests, I think, again, relates to Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell, of course, but the Marriage of Heaven and Earth is very much to do with alchemy. And that is how the novel works. One time strand working with an alchemist, and the other time strand with a Jungian analyst. And the whole business between alchemy and Jung, of course, using alchemy as increasingly as a series of metaphors and symbols. Symbols is probably the best word, about individuation and the transformation of the self. The novel works absolutely brilliantly in that way. Blake says, this gift of vision, all may have it if they will. To the eyes of a man of imagination, nature is imagination itself. Patrick and I are going to be conversing. I hope he's going to do most of the talking for about 45 minutes until we run out of steam. And then we're going to invite you all at that point to turn your mics and cameras on and to participate with questions, comments, whatever you will. Yeah. To the eyes of a man of imagination, nature is imagination itself. And Patrick writes, Blake was able, in the crucible of imagination, to forge us back into unity with the world. I love the forge imagery there, which most of you will be aware of in terms of Los or Los as the blacksmith, and the crucible of imagination. For the way we see the world, says Patrick, can restore its soul, and the way the world is ensouled can restore our vision. And so, Patrick, if you'd like to join us now, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to have you on board.
Hi, Stephen. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. Thanks for that nice introduction.
Not at all. It's no less than you deserve. So, Patrick, Daimonic Reality. We've had a little conversation about how to pronounce daimon and daimonics, and I think you're very right about your pronunciation. Our former president, Philip Pullman, it says demons. And last night I was on watching a podcast where they said daemons, but daimon is correct, I believe, isn't it?
I think it is. Yes, yes. The AE is a diphthong in Latin, and it's pronounced I think, as is the Greek AI. So
yes,
but
absolutely.
But I don't really care.
Not from the Welsh for die.
No, exactly.
Yeah. So, Patrick, tell us about, if you can, please, the sort of the nature of vision and the other world, because reading your books, I had a really strong sense of how Blake might have connected with these visions in a very real way, and a way that you talk about as both metaphorical and literal at the same time.
Yes, it's a very vexed question, the question of vision, and I don't really understand Blake's visionary capacity, because he seems to have had the most literal of visions, as it were. But visions aren't usually like that. The visionary state is more like a sort of poetic imagining, in which one is aware of the metaphorical nature of the images that you see. But people do see funny things all the time. My book, Daimonic Reality, is about the funny things that people see and have always seen, from, fairies and elves to UFOs and aliens. It's that realm, and it exists in a sort of underground world, a tremendously rich folklore that's continued to this day, which is completely ignored by, respectable institutions like churches and science and so on. So, and they mostly seem to be spontaneous. Sometimes they're more subjective, in that the person's psychological state has to be taken into account. But quite often they just seem more objective. People stumble across these things. So it's not for me to say what the nature of vision is, except, of course, that you can induce vision, by traditional means, fasting, prayer, dancing, drumming, taking psychedelics, whatever. But that's kind of that seems to be a specialist area. I was more interested in the things that people see, rather as Blake did, stumbling across a tree full of angels, or his brother come walking into the room,
Yeah, I was forgetting until I was sort of preparing to talk to you about this, that of course he has gnomes in the poem Milton, and has a fairy at the beginning of Europe, who he addresses as small sir. So there's those lovely folk traditions in there, as well as the more sort of cosmic manifestations. So, yeah, and imagination itself, Patrick. I mean, you have a history of the imagination in the Philosopher's Secret.
Yes. Well, my aim was to sort of outline what I think of as the imaginative tradition, which has been so sorely neglected. And it has a long, respectable history, but whenever it sort of flowers, it does so only for brief periods. And my contention is that the idea of the romantic imagination, which Blake was so influential in forming or in articulating for us, which was articulated more abstractly by Coleridge and his famous quotation about the primary imagination and the secondary imagination. For the Romantics, the idea of the imagination was the opposite of what we mean by it today, obviously, but it wasn't just a way of picturing things that were absent to the senses and so on. It really was, in one of my favorite metaphors, a whole other world, as the folklorists would call it, a separate realm with its own denizens, the daimons, and and indeed its own motifs, its own narratives, those strange, unauthored stories that we call myths. And they exist in this autonomous, self-governing realm, which the poet, the visionary, the shaman has access to at, well, when I say the poet, visionary, and shaman, they are the people who can voluntarily, by various techniques, enter into that other world, but which we all have access to at moments of heightened emotion, or indeed in dreaming and so on.
Mm.
And I think it's fair to say that the sort of root metaphor for this view of the imagination comes from the Platonic idea of the soul of the world, which I particularly like. I take them to be more or less synonymous, but the soul of the world is a particularly beautiful way of expressing the autonomy of imaginative life. And well, Plato first, described the soul of the world when his creator God, the demiurge, made the world. He brought it to life. He weaved throughout the whole cosmos this soul and so on. But the idea of the soul of the world was developed most fully by the Neoplatonists, 700 years later or so, particularly Plotinus. And Plotinus conceives of it as really the substrate of the entire cosmos. That the whole cosmos is soul, and everything that we perceive is an image of soul. So soul and imagination are in one way the same thing, but another way of putting it is to say that imagination is the chief faculty of the soul, that as if the soul, it's not, in other words, reason, as has often been claimed. That Plotinus and the people I'm talking about thought that imagination was the chief faculty of the soul. And he thought that it was, that everything was a manifestation of soul. He also conceived it in a different way, of course, as part of a hierarchy, which begins with the one, which emanates into the many, which is the world, Plato's world of forms. Then you get the soul of the world, which mediates between the world of the forms and our common everyday sensory world. And so that is, as it were, the transcendent model. It's a hierarchical model in which we have to, our own souls on earth have to travel up through the soul of the world, through the world of nous or nous, to the one. And that's kind of also the sort of model that Christianity took on as a transcendent ascending hierarchy. But the other way of looking at it is that, in fact, everything is soul, and that the world of nous or nous is simply the spiritual aspect of the soul of the world, and our world is just the material aspect of it, as it were. So that's the immanent or immanent version of soul. So I've never been troubled by these contradiction between the transcendent and the immanent. I've always thought that it just depends on which way you look at the soul. That one. And of course that idea was lost when all the Platonic texts were lost and rediscovered again, thanks to Cosimo de' Medici, who sent out his emissaries to gather up the ancient Greek writings from the monks who were fleeing Byzantium or Constantinople under siege by the Turks. And he found all these emissaries brought back these wonderful old Greek texts, including the entire corpus of the Hermetic literature, which was so important, and gave them to his chief translator, Marsilio Ficino, who got tremendously excited. And he himself founded an academy in imitation of Plato's academy in Florence, and taught primarily Hermetic philosophy and Neoplatonic philosophy. And he, in turn, formulated an elaborate philosophy which included magic, based on vis imaginativa, the imaginative power, which was the prime source of creation. And it was from that Renaissance base, as it were, that it got passed to, well, the German Romantic philosophers, really, and also to the English Romantic poets. In between, there was this tremendous key figure, Jakob Boehme, who was about, early 1600s. And he was a very key person for Coleridge and, of course, for Blake. And Boehme asserted unequivocally that imagination was simply the creative power of God, and that even to the extent that imagination was embodied and made flesh, in other words, in the person of Jesus Christ. And of course, we know that Jesus, the imagination, it was absolutely central to all Blake's thinking and visionary writings and so on. So that's the rough outline, in between, that these are sort of brief flowerings, really, tremendous, but whenever the imagination takes center stage, you get this incredibly fertile efflorescence of culture, as you did in Alexandria when the Neoplatonists were there, as you did in the Renaissance, as you did amongst the Romantics. And, finally, after, unfortunately, the great triumph of materialism and rationalism in the Victorian period and so on, the last great sages of the imagination, I think, were probably, well, Jung was one who translated the whole thing again, who translated the soul of the world and imagination into the collective unconscious. He turned it into psychology. And his sort of Irish counterpart, W.B. Yeats, who was my great mentor, who was a tremendous advocate for imagination and its products, folklore, myths, all sorts of weird things, magic, and so on. That was absolutely seminal to Yeats's thought, and indeed his poetry, and indeed the symbols that he used in his poetry. And in between, the people that kept it going in the early days were the alchemists, who worked in a kind of underground. But their work was, an imaginative work as Jung rediscovered. And there aren't many, I don't think there are that many sort of great mythopoeic poets in the 20th century, apart from Yeats. T.S. Eliot, I would put in that. He also had a kind of shamanic initiation through suffering and pain but his vision turned out to be Christian, which is wonderful. And latterly, Ted Hughes, who was a great advocate. But one of the amusing things is that once you are, the alchemists describe the imaginative tradition as a golden chain, an aurea catena, and that's how I like to think of it. That's a more poetic way of putting the key figures in the imaginative tradition. But the thing is that once you discover one link in the chain, as I did, Yeats, and subsequently Jung, you get initiated into all the others. They all link up with each other, because Jung had to recapitulate the whole history of alchemical thought and hermetic thought and so on. Yeats the same. They all went back to the Neoplatonists and so on, and to the soul of the world. So that's sort of the imaginative tradition in a nutshell.
That's wonderful, Patrick.
Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense to me. I've been fascinated by these connections, and some of them I've been aware of for quite a long time, and some of them I've discovered through reading your books, and others continue to sort of come forth. Just with Blake, he says, of course, which one of the things I love about him, this gift of vision, all may have it if they will. And of course, Catherine Blake too had it. Blake's mother seems to have had it. A lot of people had a sense of visions and had visions, didn't they?
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. And just in terms of Yeats, Yeats, of course, brought in an awful lot to bring Blake to a much, much wider public with the first edition full edition of Blake's poems, the Yeats and Ellis editions.
Yes,
And I
yes.
hadn't realized till recently, which shows what a lazy Blake scholar I've been in the past, just how much he wrote commentaries on so much of Blake's work. And I was thinking in terms of shamanic initiation, I wondered if there was an interesting link with a bit of Yeats there, because I was thinking of Blake famously sitting by his brother's bedside, sitting by the bedside of his brother Robert, who's dying. And Blake, I think, relates, it's probably to Crabbe Robinson, isn't it? Who commutes between the German and the English romantics, extraordinary war correspondent, going to Germany and talking to Goethe and Schiller, and then coming back and talking to Blake and Coleridge and the Lambs and Wordsworth and so on. But yeah, so Blake sitting by Robert's bedside. Robert, he sits there for, he says, a fortnight, pretty much, days and nights. And that is like a lot of sleeplessness going on. And then his brother dies, sort of absolute trauma. Blake describes, of course, his brother's soul leaving his body and clapping its hands and disappearing through the ceiling. And it occurred to me the first time the other day, those famous lines from Sailing to Byzantium, where Yeats says, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered cloak upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing every tatter and its mortal dress. And that, I don't know if that's been written up. I couldn't see anything online about it, but that seems to me that, and then Blake says of that experience that later on, Robert brings him the method of illuminated printing. And so it seems as though he's saying that he's got this knowledge from the other world that Robert brings to him that then blossoms into his work. And that's part of what shamans do, isn't it? In terms of bringing something for the receiving community from their visionary journeys.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, they bring back the treasure. Yeah, the secret, which enhances the community. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Something else you wrote about shamanic initiation that made me think of Blake was the business of the sort of demonic blacksmith who replaced the shaman's bones in his body with iron.
Well, yes, that's a Siberian tradition, initiation for a shaman was no easy matter. You were abducted into the other world and dismembered, and and your bones replaced, and your brain replaced, your eyeballs replaced, and this is very widespread tradition. And up in the Arctic Circle, the Inuits are crunched up by a great polar bear. Absolutely just torn to shreds by a polar bear before being reconstituted, and so on. And the same is true in Australia. They have many stories of shamanic initiations about shamans having crystals inserted into them and so on, and which give them a kind of second sight. This idea of second sight of Blake's double vision is very important. The idea of being able to but really the visionary state is to be able to is, as Blake says, is to see the heavenly host in the sun. But at the same time, it's really that's really a kind of symbolic representation of the thing he reviled most, which I would call literalism, and I think that part of my book on the imagination was a sort of sustained attack on literalism, which is single vision and Newton's sleep. That we only we want everything black or white. We want everything to be absolutely facts. The notion that things are double-edged, that things have a deeper metaphorical meaning, and indeed that metaphor precedes literalism in meaning, you know, or rather is more important part. Of course, you can't take your visions literally either, you know, to only see the sun as a heavenly host would be madness. But so you have to you know, see things both literally and metaphorically simultaneously, with the eye and through the eye, as Blake says. But perhaps it's only our modern folly which makes that division. I mean, I think it's quite conceivable that you know, people before the scientific revolution saw the world in that way before the division into metaphorical and literal was made, if you like. And I think perhaps Blake was one of those people. You know, he saw both simultaneously. He knew he was looking at a tree, but he also saw the dryad in the tree, as it were, you know.
He could tell an old man from a thistle, otherwise gardening would have become very strange for him.
Exactly, yes. Yes,
I'm really with you on this one. It's a both and, isn't it? And the double vision thing really explicates that extremely well. In a sense, I suppose they're Blakean contraries, aren't they? And both can apply, both can be equally true. But if they're one-sided, then we can be in some trouble.
Yes, exactly. But that kind of double vision, which is fused into where the literal and the metaphorical no longer can be separated out, is available to all of us in, for example, artistic activity. You know, paying deep attention to anything, whether it's a landscape or another person. You know, the self disappears, and you are fused with that thing, but not in a literal way and nor a purely metaphorical way, but in a kind of you know, a new synthetic way.
I just wanted to pick up on as I mentioned at the time, on the blacksmith figure who recreates the shaman with bones of iron, and the dismembering. This, I think, we again, I hadn't thought about this a lot till recently, but we find this in Blake with the first book of Urizen, where Urizen, the demiurge, is sort of coming apart and there's separate bits, and Los, as the blacksmith figure, struggles to sort of bind him back into place with rivets and metallic substances.
Oh, right. I'd forgotten that. I'd forgotten that, Stephen. Yeah.
I hadn't put the two together, but it's definitely happening there.
Yes.
I think.
Yes. No, that's most interesting. Yes.
Yeah. And because with Jung, we come to techniques of active imagination.
Yes.
Which, is very much what he says it is. He seems to drop down into himself and goes into his study and actually then starts to journey in a way that I think Blake would have understood very well.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, the thing about these people like Jung, he definitely had what you might call a shamanic calling, you know, which he resisted until he nearly went bonkers and decided to give in to his madness, essentially being assailed by all these images. But for him, madness was worse than death, especially for a psychiatrist, you can imagine. But when he gave in, he found himself not mad, having been besieged by these appalling pressure of emotions and anxieties and doubts. He found himself instead in a myth, in the myth of the solar hero dying and being reborn, you know, quite extraordinary. And so much of his subsequent psychology was based, it turns out, on that experience rather than on empirically studying his patients. So yes, that's fascinating. Yes.
And he yes, what he thought was his madness also had a prophetic resonance, in as much as he was seeing tides of blood overwhelming Europe and so on. And
yes,
the First World War followed shortly after, which must.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So like all shamans, he was also the voice of the community or the tribe, you know, that he had And in his case, it was sort of, he seems to have had an intuition about the fate of the whole of Europe. So, you know, the return of Wotan or something like that, you know, the tide of blood was, yes, the old gods returning and sweeping the old order away. Yeah.
Yes. And these are sort of destructive archetypes, or the shadow side of the archetype unleashed, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Which again, with the whole idea of the creative act and of the divine and the creative act of the artist, that gets around to the whole thing of the idea of healing. And recently, I was talking to a voice specialist who is intensely interested in poetry, and she's investigating the whole idea of poetry as healing. And we know, of course, about art therapy, drama therapy, music therapy, and so on. This relationship between the divine and the creative act within us is an important link. Again, it seems to me to be a very major connection.
I'm sure that's right. You know, if there is one malaise that we've been subject to for, you know, 100 years or whatever, it's a sort of collective loss of soul. I think that's what Elliot's Wasteland was about. It was about the loss of the soul of the world. It was about, you know, the dryness, the mundanity, you know, that attends to loss of the soul of the world, and anything that connects us back to the soul of the world, and that would be principally beauty. The soul is most responsive to beauty. Anything that connects us back through artistic activity, writing poetry or painting pictures, and especially, of course, music, which is sublime, can only be good, and can only be healing. And a lot of malaises which may have many different symptoms, but they may at root be a kind of estrangement from both our own souls and from the soul of the world.
Mm-hmm. Of course,
Elliot, I'm guessing, of course, you know, I mean, I have no idea, but that makes sense to me anyway. Yes, yeah. It's what I get from art, you know.
I completely trust your insights on this one, Patrick.
Elliot, well, I trust your insights on Blake, since I'm more Blake bluff than Blake buff, I'm afraid. Yeah,
my insights are not in any way always reliable. Elliot, of course, is quite strange about Blake in some ways. He does call him a genius. He acknowledges his genius, but he also says, notoriously, that if only Blake had a tradition, and if only Blake, you know, had a bit more reason. And he actually uses those terms. But Kathleen Raine seemed to respond, and she was a friend of Elliot's, with Blake and Tradition, 2 volumes about the tradition that Blake was in. Yes. Much of the tradition, much of which you are, of all people, very, very familiar with and have been telling us about. But Elliot then goes on, again, something that became even more aware of recently, had been for some time, that Elliot seems to borrow from Blake or echo Blake in 4 quartets, which is probably my favorite thing of Elliot's, where he references the wild time, as in the herb. Yes. But it's punning on wild time. And he has a bird, whereas Blake has a lark, and the wild time and the lark in his garden at Felpham that leads to the visionary moment. And for Elliot, this is part of the sort of the supreme moment and the climax of his poem. Yes. And I came across the fact that he'd written a letter to a friend saying he couldn't keep Blake out of the poem. So for all his sort of saying, oh, Blake had no tradition and Blake needed more reason, I think Blake found his way into Elliot quite strongly at that point, at least. Yes,
yes. I didn't know. That's brilliant. I hadn't thought of that. I didn't know anything about it, and so on. I think that, you know, he was troubled by the idiosyncrasy of Blake's mythology, really, and And it's something that Yeats also drew attention to, saying that, you know, that Blake didn't have a mythology to hand, that if he'd been Dante, he would have been quite happy with the saints and the angels and so on. But, you know, that he had to sort of create his own, or rather read his own out of the divine imagination. And but it is cobbled together from all sorts of interesting bits and bobs, you know, things like that. And the result, as Blake says, as Yeats says, is, what does he say? It's like having the spray from an inexhaustible fountain being blown into your face, you know. Lovely
That's beautiful.
Isn't it lovely, the
Yeah.
way that, yeah. So he was very responsive to Blake in that way.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the most lovely things that anybody's ever said about Blake. An inexhaustible fountain.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I've lost my thread slightly here, but in terms of sorry, I just lost my plot. I had a really strong thought in my mind, and now I've lost it. Yeah.
It interests me that Blake doesn't seem to have
Oh, I know. Yeah.
undergone the sort of initiation that is traditional amongst people of a shamanic temperament, by which I include the mythopoeic, the great poets and so on. I'm not aware of anything in Blake's biography which constitutes that turning point, which is, initiation is quite different from education, you know. It's a period of, you know, of tribulation, which is voluntarily undergone amongst shamanic cultures and amongst medicine men and witch doctors and so on, but which is involuntarily suffered by people who don't have that tradition, as in Western culture, and so on. And you know, Coleridge underwent it, and Elliot underwent it in you know, periods of the sort of appalling depression and melancholy and suffering and so on, some deep alchemical sinking down into blackness and despair. Blake seems to have been utterly unchanged. He seems to, his worldview seems to have been completely fully formed at a very early age. And I don't know, when you look at the notes he writes late in life, the worldview is just the same. You know, he doesn't seem to have, he seems to have been just sort of born fully fledged, you know, rather like Picasso, you know, who said, I don't, what did Picasso said? I don't grow, or I don't become, I am. You know, he just was always himself. And so that's interesting to me, but I don't understand it.
That almost echoes the sort of the Coleridge repetition in the infinite mind of the finite I am, doesn't it, really?
The great I am, yes.
Yeah. But yeah, Blake does have one entry of despair, where he just writes despair, and dates it. And he certainly has a lot of trauma later in Felpham, I think.
Yes, the Felpham trauma.
And so on, yeah. And out of that, I think his experience in Felpham, which seems to go rapidly downhill, and wrestling with himself, he refers to that retrospectively as I don't develop, I am. Somebody is offering in the text.
That's right. I don't
chat.
develop.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, contributor. But yes, it's he seems to refer retrospectively to sort of feeling fettered, feeling weighed down, and then being released from that later after his return to London. But
yes, my point is only that these experiences didn't transform him in any way, in the way that initiation does.
Sure.
He was always perfectly himself and clear about what his aim and purpose was, and everything else was merely a a barrier to it, you know, but
Yes.
it's merely, you know, not having enough money and so on, you know.
Absolutely, and having visionary insights from when he's a child, and
Yes, exactly.
God
Yeah.
puts his head in at the window and sets him screaming.
Yes.
When I went a little blank earlier, it's because I was just trying to remember. We were talking about Blake's imagery and symbolism, and my own mentor, my tutor and supervisor, Jonathan Wordsworth, writes very amusingly in a book called The Invisible World about Blake's imagery. And it gets so bizarre where, you know, a body is then a landscape and then it transforms into something else. And the character of Ololon, who's Milton's emanation, his feminine side in the poem Milton, she is a river. She's a community of people living by a river, and she's a 12-year-old virgin. Blake is holding all that sort of simultaneously as an idea, and it goes back to your sort of both and, in this case, sort of both and, that you can actually be all these things. And that fluidity of identity, of gender, it goes beyond our modern preoccupation with those things, I think.
Yes, well, it points to the shape-shifting nature of imagination, which is also, of course, embodied in the daimons that manifest, that are images of the imagination itself. You know, they're notoriously shape-shifting, not only in themselves but across time. You know, I would say the daimons, you know, cut their cloth to suit the times. You know, if you banish them from nature, they reappear in Victorian drawing rooms as the spirits of the sails. You know, if you banish them from matter, they reappear as shape-changing subatomic particles. You know, they're always there, you know, because they are immortal, but they tend to appear to us in ways that that appeal to us, you know. But if you repress them, they come back as well, they can come back as devils, so you have to be careful. Yeah. But yeah, shape-shifting is one of the key features of the imaginative life, you know.
Yes. And Hermes is a very major figure for you, Patrick. I'm very partial to Hermes and Mercurius in his more alchemical form, but he's the god of crossroads as well as anything else, isn't he? And
He's the god of all sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah, but aligns to that fourfold vision of Blake and Jung, both preoccupied with the idea of the fourfold in the nature of the psyche and
yes,
and beyond.
Yes. Well, Hermes is the only god that can travel from the world of the gods to our world, to the underworld. So his trajectory is a vertical one, you know, and he's the only god that can do that, and that's why he's so important. So he's the god of the depths, and he conducts the dead down to Hades and so on. So inevitably, he's also, you know, connected with all shamanic and initiatory journeys, you know, Hermes. And he's also very daimonic in that he's a trickster, he's a thief, he's the god of thieves, commerce, communication. He's like a hub of exchange, Hermes. You know, everything has to pass through Hermes in order to be mediated properly. So yes, he's very important.
Absolutely, yeah. And alchemy. Alchemy is huge in your novel, but it's nearly time to open up the conversation. And we have somebody on board tonight who I spoke to, a member of the Blake Society, who did a dissertation on Blake's Vela or the Four Zoas. It's one I wish I'd done in relation to Jung and alchemy. And again, sort of, presumably opening things up in ways in which I hadn't thought of until.
Yeah, nor me. I'd like to read that. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yes. I mean, I don't know. I know that Blake was well aware of alchemy and so on, and you get a lot of alchemical imagery in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and indeed his whole idea of, you know, contraries being contained by one thing. Without contraries, there is no progression, certainly, but he doesn't turn them into oppositions, and that's very, very key to alchemy. That alchemy is full of binary substances and principles, but they're not oppositional. They're always analogous, which is quite a different thing. And indeed, our whole society before the scientific revolution ran on analogy. That it is one of the worldviews that you can have. As above, so below. We are microcosms in relation to a macrocosm. We are a whole little world in relation to the great world. That to me seems to me not only truer to my own experience, but a much more satisfying way of approaching the universe. Like King Lear contending with the storm on the blasted heath. The storm is in him and it's outside him. And I think that the whole problem of subject and object being separated in the Cartesian manner is resolved by the as above, so below, the macrocosm microcosm model, which of course Jung reintroduced. That he thought it was all inside us and we were separate from the world, but alchemy disabused him of this. In the end, he said psyche is the world. That he made no distinction in the Platonian manner between the soul within and the soul without. We are merely a soul in miniature in the great soul, like an eddy in a stream or an island in the ocean.
Fantastic. It was you that put me on to the book Chemical Theatre, where the main thrust of the thesis in that book is that King Lear is an alchemical transformation of King Lear.
Yes.
As he goes through those various stages. And that made me think about Blake's Milton again, where I think Blake goes through transformation in which he backdates in a sense, or maybe experiences directly in Felpham, where he merges with Los, the imagination itself, and Milton, and there's this enormous marriage of them, and Milton with his feminine portion, this coming together of different forces and uniting in a single form to step forward through eternity, as he puts it.
Gosh, yes, that sounds good. Yeah.
I see you've prompted me to all these little discoveries that I've made. I'm sure other people have made them before and probably written extensively about.
Well, I'd like to read your friend's dissertation on the four zoas. Yeah.
I haven't read it.
Alchemical imagery. Yeah, it sounds fascinating. Yeah.
If we now open the floor to everyone, if they want to switch their cameras on, but still muted till we invite you forward, and use the reactions at the bottom of your screen usually to raise your hand, your electronic hand. And then
no hard questions, please.
Yeah, we have Mary Ann in the house, I believe, who does know about alchemy and the four zoas.
Uh-oh.
Don't worry. She's ever so nice, and here she is.
So my thesis was Sol and Luna burn in water and wash in fire, which is obviously alchemical imagery. And it was some instances of contraries at work in Blake's four zoas, Milton and Jerusalem, in the light of Jung's thought and his alchemical understanding in Mysterium Cognitionis. So
good God. That covers everything. Yeah.
But when you're talking about tradition, and Blake is full of other traditions, like there's the Bible, there's the Kabbalah, there's Platonism, and there's alchemy and all sorts. But
Norse myth even, yes.
Yeah, but the thing about alchemy, to me, it seems that alchemy is the most important tradition behind his vision, everything that loses holy. Because in alchemy, matter is alive with spirit, and in Platonism, with that division and pure spiritual forms and the association of matter with evil, it doesn't have that resonance of everything being holy as in alchemy. So to me, that alchemical influence is, very important in Blake.
Yes, I think, didn't Blake, the one thing he didn't like about the Platonic tendency was the separation of spirit and matter. In that sense, he was very alchemical, that he always wanted to keep spirit and matter, soul and body together.
There is no body distinct from the soul. Yeah.
Yes, but
Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and you, yeah.
But he recognized that they separate, as in alchemical processes, but
Yes.
are always united at higher levels.
Yes. So the four zoas, or that separation, without separation is no mixture. So the four zoas are like the four alchemical elements that need to be separated in order to come back in Jung's individuation process. For instance, everything has to be separated before the mixture.
Yes. No, well, that makes sense to me. Yeah, it sounds brilliant. Yeah.
And the other thing, Jacob Boehme seemed to be behind with his light love worlds and dark fire worlds, was behind the reason and energy in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and also behind Innocence and Experience, those contraries from Boehme.
I agree. Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say that, but you said it better. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. Anyway, it was great. And
thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. That's fascinating. Yeah, those contraries are so important, aren't they?
Yeah.
In every way.
Yes. Yeah.
1790, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, isn't it? It's really, it's very early in the proceedings. Now, do we have any hands up? Let's have some comments. Everyone's staying very quiet. A moment. Oh, there's a hand up from Hugo. Hugo's waving, and Kerry.
Huh.
Shall we go with Hugo and then Kerry?
Hello, Hugo. Unmute.
You're on mute. Hugo, you're muted.
Hello, back.
Hello,
Okay.
Hugo. Yeah.
I was just saying, thank you for the talk. It's very inspiring, and I'll search out your books.
Oh, good.
And read them.
Now you're talking. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the thought that came to me as you were talking is that my takeaway of reading Blake is that visions take place on a number of different levels for Blake. He's got these unbidden visions that come to him almost like hallucinations. And then you've got his description of writing Milton, the poem Milton, where he says that, this is dictated to me, by the paragraph. This involved very little labor on my behalf.
Yes.
Which is, what we all might, easily think of as a visionary experience. And something that, unless you're particularly gifted, it's unlikely to come your way. But then on another level, he says that we are, visionary experience is open to all of us. And so that's a different level where I think he's really talking more about perception. And he's talking about Los, the imagination, which gives us the ability to, interpret our perceptions. So if we use our imagination to interpret our perceptions, we enter a kind of visionary world, which he'd call fourfold vision. But then if you're very reductive in your thinking, very materialistic, you're down to single vision, which is really not visionary. So, I try, I hope that in my practice of what I do in art and design, that I'm trying to interpret my perception in an imaginative way, and in thereby, you know, partaking of that Blakean tradition.
Is that like Blake's four you know, states of mind: Ulro, Generation, Beulah,
Yeah.
and Eden?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
if you see that as, if you read those conditions psychologically, they're like sort of levels of consciousness, aren't they, or levels of imaginative power, from the single vision right up to the co-creating condition of Eden, in which
Right.
you and God co-create the world around you.
Right.
So yeah, I would say that imagination, that there is no such thing as kind of just perception, you know, that imagination always underlies perception, but we never just see things neutrally as they are. You know,
No, I mean, Blake said all that we see is vision.
Yes, exactly. And so in a sense, you know, that vision is this vague word is just a sort of heightened imaginative state that we can achieve through intense perception, you know. And that's why I suggested it was, I assume you're an artist, I can see your work behind you, that I assume that your vision comes to you as with the depth and intensity of your, which it begins with perception and heightens itself into imaginative power.
Yes, I think so. And I think that it's something, it's a, you know, this idea that children are the imaginative ones, and we lose that as we get older. I would counter that and say that as we get older, our experiences build up, and I think it can, our vision can become stronger.
Yes, I think that's probably true. I'm not sure. I think there is a sense in which children, you know, do lose their imagination. I think that's a cliche to say so, but you know, it could be recovered and so on. Coleridge said of Wordsworth that he never lost his childlike imagination of the world, that, you know, that this world seems so unsubstantial to Wordsworth. He used to hang on to a tree as he was walking to school. So shaken was he by the sort of dizzy sensation of the world being a mass of fluid imagery, you know, that he himself was participating in and co-creating, and that he never lost that power. And maybe Blake was something like that as well, but he just never lost that childlike, piercing, you know, imaginative ability, whereas so many of us do it. But I think you're right in that when if you can recover it, it's not just recovering a childlike vision, it's raised to the second power, as it were.
I think so. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
No, thank you.
I think that's the beyond innocence and experience, Hugo, isn't it, really? You know, it's gathering up both. And all this, again, it takes us to the both and, doesn't it? In terms of, I think I agree that we have a childhood access to vision. And we can lose it. We can also learn to cultivate imagination, which Jung clearly did. I mean, he practiced it as a discipline, I think, and got better and better at it from my reading of what he was up to, and then recorded those in a very Blakean way through word and image. But it's that old chestnut of perception and creation, isn't it? Do we create by our perception, and therefore our creations the greater because of our ability to perceive?
Well, yeah, I think they are.
Yeah. Blake, of course, gets the flea, the ghost of the flea, to actually model for him. He sort of does the close up on it, and he says a spirit and a vision are not, as the modern philosophy supposes, a cloudy vapor or nothing. They are organized and minutely articulated beyond all that the mortal and perishing nature can produce. which extraordinary detail, isn't it? And we see that in his wonderful drawings and the final painting of the Ghost of the Flea, which our wonderful new chair Sibylla is doing an event about and knows all about. Yeah, brilliant. I think Kerry was next. Kerry.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure how I should begin this, but yeah, I enjoyed this discussion. It gave me lots of new ideas to think about, but I also had a problem with the discussion in that you just concentrated on the big names. It's Jung, it's Elliot, it's Yeats, and always my tendency with Blake is I want to go in close. I want to get to that point in the 18th century. Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I'm going to raise a figure you didn't mention, Sigismund Backstrom. I doubt if anybody listening tonight knows about Sigismund Backstrom, but he's an important figure in the alchemical revival of the late 18th century.
I've heard of him.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, important figure. The Wellcome Library, Wellcome Museum and Library has masses of Backstrom manuscripts that he's copied out of earlier alchemical texts and so on. But on 5th of April, 1797, William Blake was one of a number of engravers who signed a testimonial for Alexander Tiller, who claimed to have invented a way of printing banknotes, proof against forgery. This, I think, is quite possibly the only time that Blake acts as a public person. He doesn't join societies. He's only briefly within the Swedenborgian Church, etc., etc. But 5th of April, 1797, he signs this testimonial, as do about 20 other engravers. But 5th of April, 1797 is also the date that Alexander Tiller is initiated into Backstrom's Rosicrucian Society. And I feel, are these separate events? Or is it, or should we say it's the same day? Shouldn't we combine these events? Are these engravers sitting around watching Tiller being initiated into the Rosicrucian Society? Glasgow University Library actually has the initiation document. It's most extraordinary moment of my life, I think, when I called up this Backstrom document and realized I was looking at an initiation into not just a Rosicrucian order, but very specifically an alchemical order, and the person being initiated was Blake's friend, Alexander Tiller. So that's why I'm not happy with going on about Jung or Yeats, or even who's the 18th century translator of Plotinus.
Thomas Taylor.
Sorry?
Taylor.
Thomas
Taylor. Yeah.
Taylor,
Great man. Yeah.
But I'd rather hear more about him than about, frankly, any 20th century figure or big name. But Backstrom, Tiller, Taylor, this constellation of Platonists, alchemists. They all know each other, and they all know Blake. Isn't that more significant?
Yes, it probably is. There are a lot of unsung heroes. I quite agree. I was making brief reference to the great mountain ranges, as it were, because I'm not a Blake expert like you.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
The more you draw attention to the unsung heroes and the minor figures, or historically minor figures, the better. Yeah, I completely agree.
There's that extraordinary passage in Jerusalem where Blake writes about the emerald tablet, what he calls the smaragdine table of Hermes Trismegistus. This is fairly deep alchemical knowledge he's got. It's not a trivial acquaintanceship, and I don't feel it's been properly explored. Not at all. That
I think you're right.
we have. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just rambling. It's just my chance to ramble. You think of E.P. Thompson, A.L. Morton, for whom Blake is this uneducated working man they can patronize. I think Blake and Coleridge are the two best read poets of their time. They'd read everything. And we ought to acknowledge that. And I think I better stop now. Yeah, I've said enough.
Okay. I think the detail is incredibly important. And has anybody written this up? Have you written this up, Kerry?
I briefly mentioned it in my thesis, yes.
Right. So
but
this
it ought to be, and oh gosh, what's his name? Mark Crosby knows the guy who owns the original of the what do I say? Of the documents signed by all the engravers as Tillich's testimonial. So Mark ought to write it up. I ought to write it up. And there's just so much more to explore.
Of course, this is hidden riches, isn't it? I think our referencing of the other figures, some of them are representative of traditions that Blake knew about and read about, and some in terms of the 20th century, I think are making the same discoveries and recognizing Blake as having already made those discoveries. It's in a sense a confirmation, and I take comfort from them both, and I'd like the both and again. Really, I'd like the detail, but also the other figures. I find helpful. It helps me think about Blake by referencing something else that reflects or expands on the limitations of my thought of what Blake's doing, which after all is very complicated, to say the least. Kerry is our vice president and can be relied upon to bring something extraordinary to the table, which he just has. Thank you very much, Kerry. Anybody else with a hand up? We're not seeing many electronic hands. Anybody with a comment? We've got 90 people in here. Oh, hello. Fantastic. Chris.
Hi.
Welcome.
Just to throw it out there, I'm just, I don't know if this will be totally relevant, but the synchronicity of today listening to the non-duality teacher, Francis Lucille, does that ring a bell? Student of Ramana Maharshi?
Not to me.
Okay, well, I was just listening to him today talking about, it's this idea of awareness, everything is awareness, and the world is an expression of God, and you fall in love with the world. Like if you fall in love with a pretty girl or a pretty boy, whatever you are, you walk down the street and everything seems beautiful and alive and brilliant. If you fall in love with the world, if you're falling in love with the expression of God, however God is being expressed in the moment. And as I was driving and listening to this, I looked at my steering wheel and it did not seem like anything I would fall in love with, but it was, but I get it. And what I'm just bringing it up here simply because the resonance with the sort of the world pushed out, the world is God, is the expression of God. And so just this overlap between the Eastern tradition that I'm familiar with, and I'm by no means an expert, and the Blakean thing. And I was also reading Israel Regarde on the Kabbalah, and this notion of the divine being expressed in the world. And so one of the things that drew me to demonic reality was the reality, so to speak, of the phenomena. And what I find fascinating, and one of the things I found incredible about your books, is it's not just an academic pursuit. It is truly, to me, an expression of God or something, and to feel that and to live from that and to help. I think your books help recognize that, and I think that's one of the bridges between being stuck in the material world and the world of the imagination, of the soul. And anyway, that's a bit of a ramble too, but I just was struck by all the different concordances.
No, it's nice. That's nice, Chris. Thank you. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, so non-duality is making a big comeback with the idealists who are being spearheaded by my little chum Bernardo Kastrup, who's a great man, and he attracts a lot of scientists, but they're all bound together by the idea of consciousness. You know, that the whole universe is conscious, but as a metaphor, that's not one of my preferred models. You know, my preferred models, as I've said at length, is more like the soul of the world or the imagination rather than consciousness, which doesn't have the same resonance for me. It sounds businesslike, sounds a bit more scientific, but it's not as beautiful. So you know, but that is certainly, they're very concerned with non-duality and so on. And so this movement is attracting both scientists and people who are interested in Eastern traditions, as I was as a youth, tremendously you know, like a lot of hippies, I went east, you know, and realized that I just couldn't cut it I didn't have the Sanskrit, you know, and it was a great joy to discover there was a kind of tradition analogous to Eastern thought in our own tradition. It's just that it wasn't taught to me at school or at university. I'd never heard of it, you know, but then I found one link in that chain and was led to all the others. So, and so I thought I'd pursue that path, but I was a Zen Buddhist for at least a fortnight, you know. I mean, it was it was very attractive to me. So
Thank you for sharing that. That's really cool.
There's a whole Gnostic thread here for me, and there always has been, really. I mean, Jung is written about in terms of Gnosticism, and he, you know, there's even one of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts is the Jung Codex, which his pupils gave to him. But they're both, you seem to get sort of world-hating Gnostics and world-loving Gnostics. And Blake and Jung are both world-loving for that non-dualistic reason, that the world can be terrible, but it can be transformed. And they both have that sense that transformation is possible in terms of how we can transform things imaginatively and creatively.
I'd go further than that with Gnosticism. I think you could make the case, if you were a Jungian, that on the basis that Freud's maxim is correct, that whatever is repressed returns in another guise, I think you could argue that the repression of Gnosticism, which disappeared, we know nothing about it apart from the reports of other people. Well, there are Gnostic texts were discovered finally, but it disappeared from off the menu for a long while. I think it may well have returned as science, but a literalized version of science. You know, instead of a quest for an existential, you know, union with truth, traveling through the cosmos to return to the Godhead. I think that science is powered by that same impulse, but it's become a much, you know, narrower, objective and so on thing. So that shut you up, yeah.
No, that's brilliant. It's the idea of a sort of, I guess, a spiritual science. I mean, I don't think I'm giving too much flattery if I would say that someone like you is doing the science of the imagination, or the sort of a Gnostic approach. I mean, I don't know exactly what you mean by Gnosticism, how exactly you would define it, but a sort of more exploratory, open, I don't know, spiritual quest, or
well, interesting. Yeah, perhaps the old Gnosticism is beginning to return into the narrow, very focused, rational, quest of science. Maybe it's becoming, yeah, more like a spiritual quest. I mean, that'd be great. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Chris. There's a reference in Desiree Hurst's book, which actually Marianne, who spoke earlier, put me onto, and you're aware of, Patrick, which is a Blake picture that seems to map onto the Kabbalistic tree of life. And of course, we know he'd read the Bhagavad Gita and was very familiar with, again, these people who were around in London at that time, as Kerry was pointing up. It was an absolute hotbed of different cults and followings and scholars of this and that discipline.
Yes.
Yeah. Gareth has a question, and or just quickly, Kerry, if you're still with us, could you put the names that you mentioned into the chat for Maria? She's keen to have them, I see. Thank you. Gareth.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Patrick. Really, I've loved your book, and it's great to hear you speak about it in person.
Oh, thanks, Gareth.
Yeah, I've had it for a number of years. Really suddenly pleased to see you popping up in the Blake Society. Great stuff.
Which one?
Sorry, the Philosopher's Secret Fire. It's a marvelous piece of work, and I had a wry smile when Kerry just wanted to ask you why you hadn't written a book about Blake. I thought that was very funny. We could just ask that question of everybody, couldn't we? Everyone that comes along. Why isn't your book entirely about Blake? But only joking, Kerry. No, you mentioned Bernardo Kastrup there, whose name I always say wrongly. I was just wondering if there are any other people that you feel today are making the case, as it were, for the imagination. It seems that we do live in quite extraordinary literal times right now. I just wondered if there were other names of philosophers or artists or anybody working, sort of in public, as it were, who inspire you in terms of imagination.
No, but that's largely ignorance, Gareth. I haven't kept up. I haven't finished reading the Bible yet, for God's sake. Give me a break. So I just can't keep up. But in a sense, that tradition could be. My trouble with what was an embarrassment of riches. That in a sense you can see the tradition everywhere, in different fragments. That's why I do so much anthropology, and I've just been reading a fantastic book, anthropological book called Beyond Nature and Culture. Nature and culture is one of the distinctions I make in my book, and this has been completely rubbished by, he's called Philippe Descola, Beyond Nature and Culture, and it's a book by this French anthropologist, and as a result it's almost unreadable, but I'm such is my quest for truth that I've been plowing on through it, and he's wonderful about making distinctions between different kinds of societies. The animist society, for instance, he thinks there are only 4 major kinds, for instance. And in those 4 major kinds, animism, totemism, naturalism, which is ours, and anagogistic societies, which was ours, you can see these are different ways of imagining the cosmos. And suddenly you get this idea that the objective universe that we all believe in is probably no such thing, that it's an imaginative creation formed out of the ways in which we investigate it, that nature always reflects back to us the state of our own consciousness, as it were. And so that, things like that, a book like that gave me many insights, but then I had to bring the imaginative tradition to it. So, you know, I would say, you know, read the sacred books, read the poetry, listen to the music. You know, it's all there. Those are the great masters are already here, and I haven't caught up on a fraction of them yet. So I'm not worried about I'm not worried about newbies coming along and spouting. Yeah, but the moment I leave this chat, I'm sure I'll think of at least half a dozen, you know, but on the spot, I can't think of anybody that I would specially recommend in that tradition. The golden chain is there for all to see. And the links seem to be dying out. I don't know. Perhaps I'm the last link in my tiny little link, you know, maybe. I don't know.
Thank you. I'll give you a spoiler alert for the end of the Bible there. It's really weird.
It's really weird.
It really kicks off.
I've heard. I've heard that said.
Oh,
could you just give me the name of that anthropological one that you just mentioned? Sorry, and then I'll.
Yeah,
and then I'll shut up.
You know, it's your, you know, if you really want it, he's Philippe Descola, Descola. Beyond Nature and Culture, but I can't recommend it. It's like pulling teeth, but if you're really dedicated, it's fascinating.
Maybe I'll get back to you on that one in the future. But thanks very much,
Gareth.
Patrick. Really appreciate
Email
that.
me. Yes,
Thank you.
Lovely. Next, there's two people with their hands up. One hasn't got their camera on, so I'm going to invite the one who has, which is Rodri, my dear friend, Rodri.
There we are. Thanks, Stephen. And yeah, thank you very much, Patrick. Let's have a look, unmute myself, see what the screen is doing. I really enjoyed that, and especially the sort of situating Blake inside an imaginative tradition and bringing that concept to my attention. And I think, I can't remember which one of you name dropped psychedelics at one point. And of course, that's kind of my area of specialism as a means of accessing the imaginative world. And it's interesting.
Patrick dropped the psychedelics, Rodri.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yes, of course. We all have, probably. I was wondering, so Jung famously was very skeptical about psychedelics and the use of psychedelics for accessing the collective unconscious. And there are a couple of letters that were published essentially where he outlines his skepticism quite explicitly. And his argument, which I find really interesting, is that it immerses you in too much too soon, and it creates a moral obligation on the seer. So if you are ignorant, you can't necessarily be responsible. But once you've seen, you either have to choose to ignore or to take seriously what you've seen. And so Jung suggests that the sort of development of a moral faculty is what's necessary to really survive an encounter with the collective unconscious on that scale and that level. And so he says that, for instance, therapy provides the right pacing for the person. It will proceed no quicker or slower than the person's faculties allow. So I was wondering what you think about that morality, and whether, you know, because Blake's morality is quite, he takes it as self-evident, I think, a lot of the time, sort of nature's morality. But I wonder to some extent whether an initiation that he didn't go through was that of being really crushed and overwhelmed by, you know, imagination, the collective unconscious, that maybe some people through in their dark nights of the soul and their real transformative experiences really are turned against the imagination in the way that, like, Stephen, you were talking about with world-hating Gnostics, which I really like that distinction of world-hating and world-loving ones. But yeah, just wondering what you think about this concept of a sort of morality as a sort of bulwark against the imagination, or something that's a necessary insulation, the development of a morality or something.
I don't know if morality is the right word.
No.
It could be. the idea is that, you know, you have to somehow assimilate encounters with the primary imagination. And if they're overwhelming, well, you could go mad, presumably. That's always to it. But, you know, imagination probably has, I think it's probably self-limiting. I think the sort of, the way in which myths work themselves out in great loops of structural loops suggests that a few elements, you know, can be combined in an infinite different number of ways. But in the end, you know, like a mythology itself, it can exhaust itself, and then a new one springs up again. As regards drugs, I don't know the answer to that. There's no question that you can have that divine vision in by taking entheogens, as they're now popularly known. But I know a lot of people who've taken the ayahuasca and all those sorts of drugs. I don't see a marked improvement in their lives necessarily. But there's no doubt that they are transformed in some way. But they're transformed, but they're also kind of a bit blown away as well. You know, I don't see them like Saint Teresa having a vision of God and then founding 76 monasteries, you know, fantastically actively, you know. I don't see them doing that. But that sounds rather moralistic, you know. My view of drugs is clouded by my early experience with LSD. My first trip was, I took 10 times the amount I should have done.
Oh, exciting.
And yeah, that was exciting. And I don't really believe in the idea of the bad trip, because I think that all trips are both good and bad, you know. Mine was, you know, I had heaven and hell. So, but having seen, having been coextensive with the cosmos, I thought, yeah, well, that's what I thought is true, is in fact true. I've experienced this now. I didn't feel any. I didn't feel like taking any more, to be honest. I thought, now I can see what the goal is. I know that somehow you have to embody that, you know, embed it in yourself. And in that sense, it's a kind of a moral imperative to transform yourself and live out the goal that you've seen, or work towards the goal that you've seen. So it provides you with I think it provides you with a strong impetus and a sense of a goal, and the sense of the oneness of all things and other mystical experiences. But whether, you know, repeated taking of entheogens is a good idea or not, I'm not sure. You know more about that than me, Rodri.
Or maybe less. How many trips have gone through?
Thanks, Rodri. Someone's asking for you to put some stuff in the chat as to the people you referenced. Time for one quick last question, and Rawi
as well, though, Patrick.
Get the name right.
Rawi. Hello. Sorry, I'm facing a few troubles with my camera, some technical issues. So I'm Rawi Kifi. I'm from Tunisia, and I'm a PhD student in intercultural studies, and I'm interested in William Blake, especially from an eco-critical perspective. And so, doing my research, I'm really struggling to grasp Blake's stance towards nature, because I feel like there's some kind of paradox or ambivalence. So he does not seem to see nature as a muse or as a trigger for some kind of inspirational or mystical journey. Sometimes I feel like he disparages nature. And so what do you think about this Blake's ambivalence towards nature? I mean, sometimes I feel like it is imagination. It has something to do with mysticism, with you know, his vision. because he always envisioned England to be a green and a pleasant land. But other times I feel like he some kind disparages nature, especially when he say that when man is not, nature is barren. So how can we solve this paradox? Thank you.
What a good question. That's yours, Stephen.
Yep, I can intercede on this one, luckily. Rawi, the last edition of Vela, our journal, which is available free for download from the website, is all about Blake and nature. And I attempt I got an article in it, attempt to address some of that, but I know exactly what you mean. In as much as he says at one point that nature has always deadened imagination in him, and at other points, nature seems to come alive and be extraordinary. And again, I think it's that both and effect. It's when he brings his imagination fully to nature, and then he becomes one with the world, and he overcomes that sense of alienation. He's very harsh on Wordsworth about nature, isn't he? But I think by the time he gets to Milton, it's pretty clear. And even in Innocence and Experience, there's an awful lot that's very positive and detailed and beautiful about nature in Innocence, certainly. But it does seem contradictory, but I think it is resolved at the end of Jerusalem, with all human forms identified: earth, rock, trees, stones, so on. So all of nature is sort of gathered back into the imagination. It's the Eden that we've lost, but that we can reclaim. And Patrick writes of that, I think, when he writes, the way we see the world can restore the soul, and the way the world is ensouled can restore our vision. When those two meet, when there is that alchemical marriage, then nature becomes wholly good, and Blake becomes a world-loving Gnostic. That's my answer. That's the best I can do at this point in the season.
Very good answer, Stephen. Yeah.
Okay, Patrick, we've reached our...
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And do write to us if you want any more information on that. But look at Vela 3, the latest one. It's free digital download, and it's all about Blake and nature. So lots of people's different takes on it. Patrick, what can I say? That was the most fascinating talk. We had a massive attendance of about 108 people. And that is a testimony to how fascinating you are, how fascinating your books are. And say all this self-deprecating stuff about what you know or don't know about Blake. I think that all your knowledge has a richness that sheds light on so many areas, and very much on Blake. And I think we can cross-reference all these things to increase our insights and understanding across the board. Certainly that's what I'm going with. We got fantastic stuff in the chat. Is Patrick writing right now? Thank you for a fascinating evening. Wonderful talk. Thank you. Before the fall, nature was translucent. After the fall, opaque. That's Marianne. That's a great statement, isn't it? Again, if the doors of perception are cleansed, then we've got the lot. Eric Nicholson's article in Vela addresses this too. Heaven in a Wild Flower, Auguries of Innocence. It's all there. Great talk. Thank you for the talk. Oh yes, interesting talk. Great talk. Fantastic talk. Well, Patrick, what can I say? Thank you again.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
It's outstanding. And
Thank you,
we show our appreciation with the strange silent clapping that is characteristic of Zoom.
Thank you very much.
I think.
I'm very, very honoured to have been invited by this august body of people, the Blake Society. I felt very, very sheepish, addressing such an august body, since Blake is not my speciality, and I don't understand him very well, if at all. And so thank you very much for having me, and thank you for whoever lasted the course. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Patrick.
Most kind.
And sheepish, as they say. You're a lamb and a tiger.
Well, it's true. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
And good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you very much.
Good night.